Saturday morning, the Experts program continues here on Power Talk, and that means Luis Alvarez, CEO of the Alvarez Technology Group, is joining us. Good morning, Luis.
Good morning, Mark. How are you today?
Doing pretty good. Looking forward to the weekend here as we kind of head towards the end of October. I imagine if you get any wind out there this weekend, you guys will be out on the water.
They're going to be taking one of the boats out. One of our Shields Harriet that we sail on is going to be scrubbed and her bottom done, some painting done. So it's a work weekend for the crew.
Okay. Well, you got to do those every now and again.
Yeah. If you want to play, you got to take care of business.
All right. So we were, you and I were talking about a story that popped up the other day from the FCC. And where this has its genesis is that they're talking about Section 230 of the Communications Act that basically covers the area of social media platforms. And there has been some criticism of the social media companies, Twitter and Facebook in general, by conservatives, that content sponsored by conservative publications or just conservative individuals is being censored by these big tech companies, that they are tamping down the distribution or prohibiting the distribution of information that they say they believe is false or erroneous in nature. And now what we have is that I believe the Trump administration has gone to the FCC and said, hey, we need to look at Section 230 in the Communications Act. Is there any sort of pushback the government can use against companies like Facebook and Twitter to say you can't censor material, just like radio and TV stations are governed by the FCC? We may drop the hammer on you. What's the latest on this?
Well, this is one of those be careful what you wish for conservatives, because Section 230 is really the only reason that social media exists. If it wasn't for the provision in there that basically says that social media companies can't be held liable for content nor for moderating that content, then a lot of these companies wouldn't exist just because of the threat of legal action. And what the FCC is contemplating isn't necessarily the government intervening into this thing, but basically making it illegal for private groups to sue social media companies if they feel they've been wronged. And on the other side of this debate is the reality that there's a lot of groups out there that feel they've been wronged, as is wont in every community. There's those that feel that somehow they're being discriminated against. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter in their minds. So this could unleash, if in fact they do reinterpret Section 230 to allow private groups and entities, and theoretically even government actors like state and local government and the federal government, to sue social media companies for the way that they handle the content, it's just going to unleash this massive wave of litigation that will cause many of these companies to either go out of business altogether, the smaller ones that are just struggling to create their platforms, or to create some sort of system to protect themselves and thereby create even more complications. So that's the other side of this equation, is that we have what we have today because of the way 230 has been interpreted by the FCC since 1996, quite frankly, and the courts. So undoing that could lead to a whole bunch of new problems that we can't even anticipate.
And you could end up with a situation where the social media companies would essentially say there can be posting of zero political content on websites any longer. And that means that Facebook and the rest of them just become places where people share pictures of their cats.
Exactly. It then becomes a matter of free speech, and you're going to have the tension between these social media companies, who are, at the end of the day, private companies. They are entitled to regulate the content on their platform, just like I, as a business owner, can regulate what takes place in my business. This isn't a government agency that has to abide by freedom of speech. There is no such thing in private enterprise.
Right.
So they can essentially just say, we're going to prohibit this kind of content. And like you said, it just becomes cats and baby pictures and birthday parties.
Right. So I guess the other thing you could make this akin to is the idea that a social media company has to allow you to publish what you want to put on their site because they let other people do it. Essentially, their argument could be you're taking away our discretion to decide what we want to have on the site. And if you go back far enough to when people used to write letters to the editor of the daily newspaper, they didn't print every letter they got. And there were often times that people probably sent letters to the editor that had, information in them that was not verifiable, patently false, and the newspapers wouldn't publish it. Is this much the same kind of thing?
That's a great analogy, and it's true. I mean, people have been writing letters and complaints and for centuries to newspapers and other entities, and they're under no obligation to publish that information or really even respond to it. So the idea of some sort of censorship has always existed. existed, at least in the private world. Obviously, in the public world, that's a whole different kettle of fish. So there are rules that govern that kind of freedom of speech. That's why if you've ever gone to a city council meeting or county board of supervisors meeting, there's a lot of wackadoodles that get up there and protest things that have nothing to do with what they're actually talking about at that point in time. But they get their 5 minutes of airtime because that's the way the system works. Right? Public comment is public comment, whether you like it or not.
Right, exactly. And I guess, just the final coda on this is politics always making strange bedfellows. A lot of traditional media has its own forms of social media that they participate in. They've got their own Facebook pages, they have their own Twitter feeds and so forth. But at the same time, those new social medias have taken a huge bite out of the advertising revenues of traditional medias. So if there was something that came along that actually put the hurt on the social media companies and caused them to ratchet down the size of their footprint or even go out of business, a lot of people in traditional media might be standing by the side and saying, oh, geez, we feel so bad about that, crying crocodile tears.
Crying crocodile tears.
You can see that as a new lease on life for them and their business model.
Yeah, and this would be a seismic shift, to say the least, in the way that social media platforms operate. And then the question becomes, how do you regulate social media sites that are offshore? You ban those altogether and say, the only social media apps and access that you can use has to be in the United States so we can regulate it. That's going to create a lot of controversy internationally. So there's a lot more to be said. And then, of course, at the end of the day, Congress gets to chime in themselves.
Right.
Because they can come back to the FCC and say, we don't like what you've done. So here, we're going to write a new law to codify the way that we think things ought to operate. But this is, to some extent, a bipartisan issue because both sides feel they're being censored.
Right.
It wouldn't surprise me if the Democrats and Republicans got together on this one and decided to make 230 even worse, quite frankly.
Very true. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Luis Alvarez, CEO of the Alvarez Technology Group, has been our guest this Saturday morning here on Power Talk Radio. Online, it's alvareztg.com, at alvareztg. That's the Twitter handle. And Luis, the toll-free number for the I-Team.
Give us a call at 866-78-I-Team. That's 866-784-8326.